What characterizes civilization agiographically is that it appears in an area endowed with what I call following in the footsteps of an author called David Pozandé, a good articulated thalassography. What is articulated thalassography? It's a relationship between the surface area of a continent and the length of its coastline. The more coastline you have for the same surface area, the more favorable it is to trade, since trade by sea is extremely efficient, but it also has consequences for political formation, because when you have a continent with a very high degree of articulated thalassography, it's also a continent with a very high degree of relief in relation to its surface area, and therefore separates a whole host of geographical zones, each of which will be conducive to the birth of a state that will be independent and easily independent, because it will have natural borders that will enable it to defend itself relatively easily. Of the political distribution of the continent, i.e. the stability of the territory of the countries, what Pozandé calls the rotten mother. It's a neologism he's coined, but it evokes this, i.e. the geography favorable to the construction of these rotten mothers. Geography favorable to the construction of these differentiated and stable states. And conversely, by corollary, a geography that prevents the emergence of a single pole that would tend to take over the whole of space, which is the case in the era that is rather that of Civilization D, which each time spreads over large spaces that are essentially flat, with very few natural borders, and are therefore open to the four winds. But this is also the case, as I mentioned earlier, in Eastern Europe, for example, where borders have always been extremely fluid because there are very few mountains. Once you go beyond the Carpathians, the whole of Eastern Europe between Poland, Lithuania, and all the way to the Black Sea has seen its borders change for centuries. Political entities constantly appearing and disappearing precisely because the geography was not conducive to maintaining them. This is not the case in Western Europe, where all states have existed for a long time. And why is it important for states to survive and evolve over time? For the reasons I explained in the previous video, the one I did on national revolutions, but talking a little about the construction of nation states, I explained that the construction of a nation state takes around 600 years from the base, where there is no state, where there is a feudal regime, to the appearance of a parliamentary nation state which has completed its national construction. I also told you that this construction is only possible if there are no external disturbances. And I told you, for example, that the 100 Years' War, which consisted of regular invasions of French territory by England, it took France over 700 years to make the transition from feudalism to parliamentarianism, whereas England took 650 years, right? So territorial stability of the territory is the key, because as long as the territory, the space, is secure, evolution proceeds linearly and without difficulty towards the point I mentioned earlier, which is the national revolution, without it being a matter of course. The national revolution, without this being a terminal point, of course, since I was asked the question last time and I explained that afterwards, the parliamentary nation state evolves towards new forms, but building the nation state, reaching that point, takes 6 centuries in an undisturbed place. So I'd like to thank the Count of Montenegro, who has given us some biff since he's made a very handsome donation. He asked me a question which I'll answer later when we move on to the war room, since it concerns the future of the euro, and that's when I'll deal with it. Remind me of the question if I don't think of it later, but in any case I'll wind up the chat so as not to miss any. So here's the first thing. Civilization appears in the place with the most favorable geography, and that's where it develops, because what characterizes civilization is that it's basically a collection of small states that would reach a very, very high level of power through competition. So firstly, through their competition and through their political evolution, since, as I say, it takes 6 years to create an astonishment. There's also the fact that parliamentary astonishment is a regime that offers extremely significant economic and entrepreneurial freedom, which frees up energies enormously, and it's this that notably favors the great movements of distant trade, and through this colonization, the creation of navies, powerful warfare, etc. And it's this that leads to the creation of the most powerful countries in the world, and it's this that leads to what are basically dwarf states. These small states, compared to the great empires that existed at the time, to ultimately dominate the entire world. This phenomenon has been studied by several authors. The only one whose name comes to mind now is Niall Ferguson, who wrote a book called The West and the Rest, which has been translated into French, but under a different title, it seems to me, in which he explains and notes the 6 major competitive advantages of the West, what we call the West at the base of Europe, in relation to other countries, other civilizations. And among these, there's the fact of never having the appearance of a unitary state, which is generally necessarily imperial and therefore necessarily sterilizing, because all the great imperial states, what Toynbee called universal states, are based on technocracy, Mandarinism, and therefore tend to stifle free thought and so on. On the other hand, having competing states, as was the case in Europe and as was the case in Greece before that, means that free thinkers always have something to fall back on. Those who are threatened with a right can always go elsewhere, and this is what enables the debate of ideas, and the debate of ideas enables scientific progress, technological progress, and therefore ultimately superiority over empires with more stable but more intellectually sterile regime. So you see, where do these civilizations come from? To compare their, I'll leave you with the previous map so as not to lose it, here, to compare their extensions, so you can see where they were born. It's the same as on the 2 previous maps. The era of departure, let's say, the birthplace of Greek civilization and that of European civilization, and then you have everything that can be called the colonial era, i.e. the part of the world that was directly colonized, i.e. occupied, sometimes with large settlements, sometimes simply with trading posts. I'm not going to discriminate, it's just a rough map to give you an idea of the hold these civilizations end up having, born on a corner of the table, you might say, on a global scale, and which end up imposing themselves on the whole world through this colonial movement. So I'm going to leave you with these maps, going back over the stages that I developed in my history of the century to come. Still available on Amazon and in the good leagues, of course. Here are the major stages, which could perhaps be subdivided in detail, but let's just say that in broad strokes you can paint a picture like this. So a civilization A's trajectory begins with the invasion of the territory of civilization A by a foreign empire of superior civilization. For the territory of Greece, the whole of the territory of Greece that you see there, it was the Achaeans who came from a much smaller part of Greece, the builders of the Mycenaean Empire. When we speak of the Mycenaeans or the Achaeans, it's more or less the same thing. The ethnic group of the Mycenaeans were the Achaeans. I think I'll do a program about the Achaeans one day, but today we're only going to talk about the Mycenaeans. Today we're going to talk about Europe and Greece, and we've already got a lot of work to do. In the same way, most of Western Europe was invaded by the Romans. This empire was driven out by barbarian populations who overthrew the order of the first invaders. In the case of Greece, this was the Dorians, who called it the return of the Heraclides, since mythologically they saw it as the return of the children of Heracles. It was these Dorians who invaded the whole of Greece and the Peloponnese, and in particular the Spartan elites were Dorians. So I've been asked this question, and I'm going to answer it right away, since it's part of what I'm saying. Can Sideria be included in the colonial era of European civilization? Well, you could put it there. We could put it there, because after all, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of this question, but part of the colonial movement of the Greeks was carried out under Macedonian aegis, i.e. Alexander's conquests. What you see on this map is the conquest of the Persian Empire. And in previous videos I explained that what corresponded to Macedonia, which you noted as Civilization E, would today be Russia, which is a civilization that borders on Civilization A, but isn't really part of it, even though it's close on a number of levels. So if we want to draw a parallel, we could consider that everything colonized by Russia, i.e. the whole of Siberia, is also part of this colonial era. As I said, this map is really meant to give a quick idea, so you'd actually see an even bigger footprint with this interpretation. So back to my A trajectory. Third step, so why is the second stage of collapse important, of the collapse of the first empire? Because if we'd stayed in an empire like the Romanian Empire, Empire or the Mycenaean Empire. Well, we'd be in precisely what I'm telling you, a Mandarin technocratic state that occupies all space. And that's not good for development. The fact that there is a barbarian invasion is what brings everyone back to the state of fragmented public power, where there is no longer a state, anarchy, from which feudalism emerges. And feudalism, once again, is the first stage, the basic stage we might say, on which national construction will then be possible in areas that are sufficiently protected from major geostrategic movements that remain stable and therefore enable a prey to be built. Once again, I refer you to the previous program. This opens up a period of gestation for a new order, what we call the Dark Ages in English, since it was English literature that coined this term, the English scientific dates, for Greece. And in Europe, of course, we speak of the Middle Ages. This was a time when major communication routes were becoming dangerous, when economic exchanges were disappearing, and we were reverting to a local subsistence economy, and where, for the most part, the cultural heritage of the previous era is forgotten. The fourth stage, then, sees the gradual reappearance of political entities that are all part of the same civilization. Greek cities on the one hand, and European kingdoms on the other, all sharing the same culture. All Greeks were aware of belonging to the same Hellenic civilization, and all Western Europeans were aware of belonging to this Christianity, daughter of... there was also religious unity. Since the Greeks had the Olympic Games, they had the Panhellenic sanctuaries at Delphi, while in Europe everyone recognized the authority of the Pope. Then the next stage is that there is a progressive cultural differentiation between all these entities, which develop their own identities as they build their nations, and so you have cultural differentiation, and each political community and the political communities between them become rivals and seek to obtain a form of hegemony over the others. This can be seen in the long struggles between the Greek cities, the self-interested struggles, but the same goes for the European states. I don't need to give too many examples. But there's also the question of progressively religious cultural differentiation. The Greeks, for their part, increasingly endowed themselves with tutelary divinities or divinities with local particularities, and in Europe we've seen religion progressively structured by state. You had Gallicanism in France, Anglicanism in England. Spain has always had its own Catholicism with its own Inquisition. The German principalities, on the other hand, have a tendency to turn to Protestantism, so the tunes are culturally different. The next stage was the emergence of colonial empires, made possible by the fact that Civilization A societies were experiencing internal upheavals, what the Greeks called stasis, i.e. a crisis that drove part of the population into exile, to flee persecution, to seek their fortune elsewhere, or simply to go and find something to eat, when a city had supply problems because the population was becoming too large. Because one of the consequences of peace and security in a given area is a constant increase in population. And so in Europe, the same movement was provoked in particular by the wars of religion. Secondly, and this is what I explained to you last time, national revolutions also encouraged this colonization movement by changing the country's elites from real estate elites, large financial landowners, to securities elites, i.e. large-scale traders, merchants who have an interest in finding outlets, opening trading posts, etc., and thus conquering the seas and populating beyond the seas. Another stage in this process, which is also decisive in the identity of Civilization A, is its confrontation with Civilization D, since it is located on a sort of continental outgrowth of the territory dominated by D. I refer you to the program on the history of the heart of the world. And this is an important struggle in the creation of an identity that is transnational, i.e. specific to all the peoples of Civilization A. You have the confrontation between the Greeks and the Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, and in the same way you have the confrontation of the Europeans against the Turks. You have great battles. Each time you have sea and land battles. You have Salamis and Plataea for the Greeks. You have Lepanto. You have the Battle of Vienna. The battles of Vienna for the Europeans. Then you have... now, I'm going to digress a little from what I was saying about the history of the century to come, because these are things I want to refine with the new things I've been developing lately. You have the appearance at a given moment of an antagonism within civilization, which will lead to a kind of all-out war and the exhaustion of civilization. Among the Greeks, this was the Peloponnesian War, in which Sparta and Athens were immediately exhausted, all to the benefit of Macedonia, which was then able to extend over Greece. In Europe, it was the two world wars that enabled the USSR and then the USA to become the dominant powers on the continent. Now, that's not to say that this kind of thing only happens once, because, for example, as I explained to you, and here I refer you to the question of revanchist imperialists, you've had other editions of this. The two world wars were a trajectory of revanchist imperialists, Hitler's, but there have been others before. It could have happened earlier. In fact, it happened earlier with the Greeks. There weren't several editions. With the Greeks, there's only one. It's the Peloponnesian War. There are no other great wars like that. It immediately collapses. Presumably, I think, and this is the latest state of my research, this happened several times in Europe. The important thing is that the Thalassocracy is defeated and is then no longer in a position to oppose e-civilization. England was not defeated by Napoleon at any time. Notably, Sparta won against Athens and destroyed its fleet, which meant that Athens never returned to its former power and was no longer able to counter Macedonia. Whereas in European history, England has never been invaded by Napoleon. Since it won at Trafalgar, among others, there have been others, which means that throughout the 19th century, England had the power to prevent Russia from dominating Europe, which is what Russia was seeking at the time, since the Crimean War was a war to prevent Russia from overrunning the Ottoman Empire and then being too capable of competing with England. With the Greeks, it happened much earlier. They were exhausted much earlier. For us, it happened a little later, when it was Germany that took its revenge imperialism, shall we say. But when that time comes, that civilization is exhausted. So it then allows neighboring, more imposing civilizations to stick their noses into its affairs and, in the end, dominate it, since the end result is that the whole of civilization A ends up being dominated by civilization B, i.e. Europe by the United States and Greece by Rome. So you ask, I've got a question. Good evening. All these civilizations B have founding myths. Civilizations A don't seem to have any. Is that right? Well, if civilizations B do have founding myths, you'll have to revisit what I said in the program I did on the United States. I'll have to do it again on Civilization B because I didn't say everything. But Civilization B comprises just one nation, in fact, which then extends beyond its borders and onto the core, which is built into a world empire. But it's a single nation born of an independence revolution, as I explained, and that's where its common myth comes from. In Civilization A, however, this is not the case. The founding myth it may have is, on the one hand, its heritage from the previous empire. In Europe, there has always been a regret and nostalgia. Nostalgia for the unity of the Roman Empire or Charlemagne's empire. But that's about it. So people ask me, hello, do your models take mass immigration into account? I think we'll be talking about immigration later on, if I forget to mention the month. So all this is what characterizes the global evolution of Civilization A. Then there's what we might call its internal evolution, which is an evolution that takes place at every level. And in my history of the century to come, I divided this into 6 categories: institutions and political organization, right-wing society, agriculture, religion and relations with the outside world. So it's quite long, so I'm not going to read it all in detail, but I do want to give you an overview so you can see the similarity in evolution over the long term, because it's pretty profound. First of all, the whole thing can be broken down into 5 periods. The first period is what I'd call the first gestation period. There are 2 of them, i.e. the period when there was a total absence of the state. So for the Greeks, it's the archaic era and the era of the obscure scepters. For Europe, it's the Middle Ages, between the 6th and 11th centuries. So you have a political organization that is an aristocratic order based on the possession of land and war, with a public power that is fragmented. I won't come back to that. I've already talked a bit about it. At the society societal level, you have a caste system with primitive modes of justice, a rural society that is very peasant and communitarian. In terms of arts and culture, you have arts that are almost exclusively religious, since this was a very superstitious period, in particular because all the accumulated knowledge, as I said, has disappeared. So we're back to mythical explanations of the world. So if you look at the Middle Ages in Europe, you have art that is essentially present only in religious sanctuaries. Rich lords built fortresses, not landings, and theater was limited to what were called Christian mysteries, which were religious performances. In the same way, for the Greeks, theater was initially a mode of worship, a Dionysian cult, and poetry mainly evoked mythological issues. As for religion, I've already talked about that, so I won't come back to it. It's a religion that's common to all, and not yet differentiated between the different religions. As far as science is concerned, there isn't any at the time. Religion is the only explanation of nature, and when it comes to inner relationship, it was a period of isolation, and we were content to resist the inner world because the degree of civilization was inferior to the most advanced contemporary civilizations. 6th century Europe was unable to compete with the East Indies, which had been conquered in particular by the Slavs. As for methods of warfare, at that time, war was mainly the affair of the aristocratic caste, with small armies and wars that were private wars. The second gestation period was marked by the re-emergence of central powers at kingdom level, so that's the stage I left off earlier. Politically, this is accompanied by the emergence of central powers in the corresponding geographical zones. I'll show you something about this. In fact, we're going to change the maps. I'm going to start by showing you a map that will show you. It was around the end of the year, I think, says José Roder in his book L'Énigme grecque. Here you have a relief map of the Peloponnese. I already explained a little bit about Europe last time, so I won't come back, but you'll see that it also works for Greece. Here you have a relief map of the Peloponnese. And if you look at the map of the major cities, it's very interesting because you can see that geographical determinism, as you can see, is reappearing. You see, if you look at Argos, for example, you see that it occupies the space of a large valley that's deep in the mountains. If you look at Sparta, the territory of Laconia, it's also a valley between two mountain ranges. But at the same time, Sparta conquered neighboring Messenia, which itself represented a bit of the same parallel, but smaller, so it managed to dominate it. If you take Elis above, which also dominated the city of Olympus, you can see that it also corresponds to plains. The same goes for Corinth. The same goes for Megara, which lies on the isthmus of Corinth between two mountain ranges. The same goes for Athens, which reigns over the whole of Athens, and Thebes, which reigns over the abbey too. You see, these are the great Greek cities. And if you look at a map of Europe with the European kingdoms in the Middle Ages, you get the same idea. So there you have it. These entities appear. At the same time, exchanges began to take off on a societal level, leading to the emergence of a bourgeoisie. Small urban centers begin to reappear, since these are basically commercial nodes, and so you have the emergence of a new class. And you've got coins starting to be minted and circulated again, because it's easy to exchange, you need money. Then in the arts, art begins to detach itself from religion. Why was this? Because as you have the emergence of a bourgeois class, who want to entertain themselves, who want to have works of art for themselves too, well, art will start to represent the preoccupations of the class that has the money to pay for it. So when it was only the church that had money, it was all religious. When it came to the bourgeoisie, we began to see, in the case of the Greeks, the development of luxury furniture, ceramic vases, debarked gardens, and so on. And in Europe, secular pictorial representations began. So you have the Bayeux tapestries, which are the oldest. You've also got the famous lady with the unicorn, and later you have the appearance of pieces of luxury furniture. You've got paintings like Van Eyck's Arnolpini, which are very famous. So religion began to decline in favor of a more rational approach to things. The Greeks introduced a philosophy of nature. And in Europe you have the rise of a rationalism that begins with Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism, the desire to frame faith by reason, to reconcile the two, but also to give give ever greater power to reason, the desire to explain, to provide clear explanatory diagrams. Then, in terms of relations with the outside world, you have first of all an assertion of independence and the first offensives. You have the very first colonies in the Black Sea, launched by the Greeks, and in southern Italy. And in Europe, of course, you have the Crusades, with the establishment of Latin states and the reconquest of Spain. In terms of the evolution of warfare methods, you have the development of larger armies assembled under a command that is superior to the traditional aristocratic echelon, and therefore with larger armies. This marks the beginning of the transition to the hoplitic army in Greece. The hoplitic army began to be an army of citizens who had the money to buy their own equipment. In Europe, this coincided with the birth of bourgeois and communal militias, in particular those that assisted Philippe Auguste in the Battle of Bouvines. And so it was that the so-called feudal Oste and all the constraints it might have had on its convocation and direction were overcome. The third period was the Renaissance, the consolidation of the state. As far as political institutions are concerned, we have a state that is completing its normalization with a political entity that concentrates public power and begins to address all aspects of what we call the regalian. This was the era of Dracon's reforms in Greece and Chilon's in Sparta, with the emergence of the epores. In France, it was the Renaissance. In Europe, it's the period of the Renaissance and the emergence of royal absolutism, or what I call administrative monarchy. So the last show, the bourgeois class expands thanks to the evolution and growth of trade. It's a continuous movement, more and more security, more and more money to finance it, so more and more trade. And the bourgeoisie began to gain political weight, replacing the old warrior aristocracy, from the moment the state assumes the protective role previously played by the aristocracy. In the arts and culture, art became mainly secular, with theatre turning away from religion, often becoming political, philosophical, and critical of bourgeois society. And this was the moment when the canons of the previous civilization began to be rediscovered. At this point, Greek theatre had moved away from Dionysian civilization, and in Europe the canons of Greco-Roman art were rediscovered, and secular theatre multiplied. It was the great age of secular theatre, with Shakespeare, Molière, and so on. In terms of religion, this was the moment when religion came into tension on the scale of civilization and what we might call nationalization of religions. In other words, it starts to become a component of local identity and therefore differentiated from that of neighboring states. I mentioned this earlier. At the same time as national identities developed, so did the cult of the founding hero in Greek city. In Europe, the principle of cuius regio aius religio was to prevail. You see, each region has its own prince's religion, like king, like religion, you could say. It's an elegant tradition. In the sciences, it's the rise of philosophy, with reason breaking away from religious beliefs and the increasingly marked decline of mythical and traditional explanations. So, in Greece, it's the Pythagoreans, it's the sophists, and the emergence of tensions with traditional religion. You've got Anaxagoras of Clazomena, who was accused of atheistic impiety because he said that the moon was a big rock and that the stars were probably balls of fire. The guy was brilliant. He had no way of verifying it. He guessed everything. And the same goes for someone like Protagoras, who was a sophist, who doubted the existence of the gods. In the same way, in Europe, you've had cases of science clashing with religion. You've had the executions of Giordano Bruno, Etienne Nollet. You've had the house arrest of Galileo. You've had the need to go into hiding in the United Provinces for Descartes. So it's this period, as far as foreign relations are concerned, it's the time of decisive victory over the powerful sectarians who had been a threat up to that point. So it's the medieval wars, the Athenian-Persian victory, which you mentioned earlier, and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire for Europe. As far as methods of warfare are concerned, it's time for the disappearance of private warfare and the development of standing professional armies by national entity, with the disappearance of the caste system. So it's the appearance, the finalization of the phalanx politics of the citizenry, with a change in the style of combat. From now on, it's a collective style of combat. His neighbor To give a highly cultural reference, you have what Leonidas explains in the Trossen, and the same thing in Europe with the appearance of increasingly large masses of soldiers under the Ancien regime in wars between kingdoms, with the appearance of the first very large battles. And we can say that the first example of this is the Spanish tercios, which was really a construction based on the phalanx because there were large sarif. So I've been asked a little question, which I'm going to answer right now because it's important, and besides I'm at the junction with the classic eternity period, so it gives me a chance to breathe. You think that northern Italy in the Middle Ages has a number of points in common with the model you present of Civilization A? Yes, because for all the phenomena I'm actually explaining, and one day I'll have to make a summary video on this, I don't want to get bogged down in it, but phenomena always tend to repeat themselves in the right circumstances. I don't want to get into it, but phenomena always tend to repeat themselves in the right circumstances. So when you have a whole bunch of cities like that in an Italy that was fragmented because it had been torn between neighboring powers, this effectively favored a breakup and the emergence of a whole bunch of neighboring city-states next to each other. But it couldn't have been an A civilization. Why couldn't it be? Because there's a question, I think I already talked about it a little last time, but I'll have to talk about it in depth in a program, because there's also a question of scale, and the standard scale for Civilization A was the size of the kingdoms, the large territorial states, which are all roughly the same size, as I told you, in Europe, just as we were on the same order of magnitude in Greece, and so it's the same mechanics, if you like, that create these groupings. But what makes Civilization A become Civilization A is that it also corresponds to the scale of its era. I'm going to do a show where I'll talk about these questions of change of scale from one site to another because it's an important issue. I think I'll talk about it the day we do a very long-term perspective program to find out what's going to happen after what we call the continental states, i.e. China, the United States, Russia, which are very, very big states, and it's hard to see how we can do more without leaving our planet. Spoiler, we'll be leaving our planet, but I'll do a show about it, I promise, one day. Fourth period, the classic period of eternity, in which oligarchic or democratic regimes are established across the board, but with a democracy that tends to respond. The development of what we might call an identitarianism of states, one against the other, when they really want to assert themselves and to multiply conflicts with a glorification of history and national history. So that's Kirsten's reforms, it's Athenian democracy, it's also the English revolutions, the French revolutions, the extension of citizenship, suffrage, etc., which are questions that we also had. On the societal level, it's the disappearance of the old aristocracy and a movement towards equal rights for all citizens, with large urban centers beginning to reach record sizes to the detriment of rural areas. In terms of art and culture, art loses virtually all religious significance and tends to become more and more entertainment. This is how theater became popular entertainment in ancient Greece, but also in modern art. And then you have the appearance of opera, cinema, etc., which is often less and less philosophical. And political, less and less a message. Religion is pushed out of the public sphere by the rationalization of the political domain, and you have anti-religious reactions with intellectuals seeking to give even traditional beliefs a rational origin. Religion is attacked outright. In modern times, it's all too familiar with mythological theories, such as those which claim that Jesus never existed, or that the Gospels are literary constructs, and so on. It also existed in Greece, where there was a movement known as ephemerism, which originated with a Greek poet called Ephemerus, who theorized that all the gods of Greek mythology were in fact heroes who had subsequently been deified, remembered, and given divine properties. Today, what is known as the ancient astronaut theory is called neo-ephemerism. You know, those who believe that the gods of ancient mythologies were in fact extraterrestrials who came to visit Earth at the time. This is called neo-ephemerism, in reference to the ephemerism of antiquity. In the sciences, it was the development of general education. Literacy spread rapidly with a system of instructionalization which went hand in hand with the quest for equality. Since people were informed, they were more inclined to want to participate in public affairs. Education ceased to be sacred, esoteric or initiatory, and became open to all. So it was that the sophists developed general education, the emergence of the philosophers' Grande École, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, and in Europe the emergence of public education more or less everywhere. In terms of relations with the outside world, it was the explosion of the colonization movement, with the total subjugation of all former enemies and the attainment of global hegemony. This is truly the pinnacle of civilization. As for warfare methods, these were imposing armies, with masses of highly disciplined infantry, and the development of conscription in particular. And so wars became increasingly costly in terms of human losses, when we're not talking about colonial warfare, but war between states. Of course, everything I'm telling you here can be broken down into these major phases because we're talking about a whole host of states that are not all at the same stage of development, as I said, since it takes around 650 years, but some are moving faster than others. England went faster than France, the Earth went faster than Sparta, but there may be a gap of a century or two between each country, which is why not all are at the same level in what I'm explaining over time. But broadly speaking, we can still classify them into major historical periods because they're never far apart and they influence each other, with the nations that are furthest ahead pulling those that are a little behind. The fifth stage is what I call the late period, the end of sovereign nations, starting in the 4th century BC for Greece and from the years of the Year of Europe. So, in terms of political institutions, there was lasting peace between states, but relatively under foreign control, with a weakening of democracy to the benefit of an oligarchy at the orders of the dominant foreign power. So it was the Pax Romana in Greece, American domination, and relations with the European Union, a subject we'll be dealing with at length later on, and which will be at the heart of our analysis later on. In terms of society and the law, it's a period of loss of dynamism, precisely because as foreign control takes hold and as the continent begins to achieve relative unity, we find ourselves in a situation that I've already described to you, what we call universal empires, which tends to crush innovation, as I was saying earlier. So that's how the Greek cities were governed by a pro-Macedonian oligarchy at the time of Macedonian domination, then pro-Roman, and in Europe it's Brussels and its technocracy, supported in a way we'll see shortly by the United States, that has this effect. In the arts and culture, it's a phase of importing the entertainment of the dominant power, adopting its standards. In Greece, for example, we saw the arrival of Roman-style games and fighter bombing, which didn't exist in Greece. The Greeks had games that we now call sports athletics, that's Greek, but they didn't have fights between detractors, they didn't have fights between beasts. Imported from Rome, and in the same way, in Europe, it's American cultural colonization, with the predominance of American programs and audiovisual models. In terms of religion, it's the development of religious syncretism and relativism, and the appearance of new or imported spiritualities, i.e. exotic spiritualities, at the expense of traditional beliefs. This is how the Hellenistic period became marked by syncretism, with the growing role of Eastern cults. A divinity like Sarah is an Egyptian-Greek syncretic divinity, and if you take Europe today, it's the end of religious authorities, a religion a la carte, and a massive importation of all kinds of foreign cults, Buddhism, New Age, the multiplication of sects, Islam of course, just as there was also Judaism in certain Greek communities in Syria and Egypt. As for the sciences, it was the loss of technical and scientific supremacy, which then passed to Civilization B, which became the world's driving force. In terms of relations with the outside world, it's the loss of colonial space, the loss of influence to the new great powers, and in terms of methods of warfare, it's an absence of military activity outside of joint action with the new dominant power. And it's also marked by a decline in there's a quote I really like from Polybius, which clearly shows this loss of dynamism, and in particular of demographic dynamism. It's amusing to see, and sad at the same time, to see that the Greeks experienced this decline in the birth rate in the same way as Europeans today, which necessitates mass immigration, as I was asked earlier. I'll read you this extract from Polybius's history, Book X7. I'll explain a little later who Polybius is, because we're going to see him again. He said this about the Greece of his time, in the 12th century BC. This decline in population, this shortage of men, which today is felt throughout Greece, and which makes our cities deserted, our countryside uncultivated, without, however, continuous wars or scourges such as the plague having exhausted our doors. If we thought of sending to consult the gods on this subject and ask them by what words and deeds Greece could be more populous and the cities happier, would it not be folly to do so when the cause is obvious and the means to remedy it are within ourselves? That's interesting. We'll see. We'll get back to today. In the midst of a population given over entirely to pride, greed and laziness, unwilling to marry or to feed children born out of wedlock, or at least to feed only one or two of them, in order to leave them with greater wealth and raise them in the bosom of abundance, evil has secretly grown rapidly. Of these two children, war or disease often destroys one. As a result, homes have necessarily become little by little solitary, and just as among the swarms of bees, cities have lost, along with their population, their power. What's the point, once again, of asking the gods for the means to repair such damage? The first man to come along will tell us that all we have to do to remedy the situation is to correct our morals, or at least force fathers by law to raise all their children. There's no need for soothsayers or augurs here. See then, this description of the Greek world is very interesting. It shows that once a certain stage of civilization is reached, it seems natural for people to have fewer children. It's not linked to modernity, it's not linked to the contraceptive pill, it's civilizational. There's a kind of weariness, as if civilization was tiring itself out and saw no point in continuing. Today, when you see people explaining that for the sake of the planet, they don't want to have any more children and all that, that's the idea. This idea that we're having fewer children to make sure we can leave them all some money, or that it won't be too much of a handicap. I've been asked, can anyone tell me the date of the card? There isn't really a date on the card, although, roughly speaking, it's from the 5th century BC, i.e. before the Peloponnesian War. But the territory of the cities was sometimes shifting. Nargos often came under the hegemony of Sparta, and so on. No, there's no blood before Jesus Christ, it's earlier. We're going to see some later maps now. Well, yes, it could also be blood before Jesus Christ, if you like. It's the nominal territory of the cities, but they weren't necessarily separate, antagonistic, as this map seems to show. So one thing I want to say to you now, to help you draw the parallel and understand it, to help you understand what the European Union was like in ancient Greece. That's the little thing I'm going to talk about now. I want to insist on this aspect because the aim of these reminders of black civilization is for you to understand what it is, and above all that you understand why I'm going to explain to you that Europe must continue to evolve as Greece has evolved. And in particular, what's interesting is that you'll want to say to me, yes, but hasn't Greece known the European Union? And that's precisely where it's interesting, because yes, Greece has known the European Union, and it was called the Koinon Achaean, i.e. the Achaean League, which was a federative political institution, federal regime, which brought together most of the Greece you see there under its authority. So what was my next map? I have to do this myself. So this was to show you, for example, that the city of Sparta had been, as I said earlier, the two valleys, because Sparta succeeded in dominating a second area. Here, I'd like to refer you to what I said in my previous program about national construction, particularly that of France. You'll remember that in France, as I explained to you, the typical national construction is you have a place that is the great national plain that will impose itself on a territory, then by putting on its margins what were the more rugged territories. Okay, but you have countries like France that have a large plain and a smaller one. In France, it's the plain, the Paris Basin, that's the big one, and you've got the Aquitaine Plain, which is smaller, but close enough to be dominated. That's how the French territory came to be. In fact, Sparta is similar. You have two plains. She managed to dominate both by conquering Messenia. People ask me, is this the same thing as the Delos League, the Achaean League? No, it isn't. The League of Delos was the league set up around Athens. It was Athens' network of alliances, in fact. So it has nothing to do with that. The Achaean League, I'll explain in detail. So this was the Peloponnesian League. It was the height of Sparta's power. It was all the allies she had managed to gather around her. It's important to know that because we've kind of lost that. The great Greek city, the great power for the longest period of Greek history was Sparta, not Athens. It's Sparta. The great Greek power is Sparta. Athens began to spread its wings in the 5th century by creating the League of Delos. I think I've shown you a map of the allies during the Peloponnesian War. Here it is. So you see in red Athens and its allies, and in green Sparta and its allies. So in green, the Peloponnesian League, you can see it very clearly, with just Argos, which is independent, and what's called Achaia, i.e. the crest of the Peloponnese, there, the north, and Macedonia, which was also allied with Sparta. And Athens had created the League of Delos, so it had all its allies, and in particular it was mainly a maritime power. So, as I said, the Peloponnesian War exhausted these countries, these city-states, which were then dominated by the Macedonians, who invaded all of Greece at the time of Philip II of Macedonia, Alexander's father, who conquered all of Greece except Sparta. Then you had Alexander's empire, then you had Alexander's descendant Diadochus, the Antagonids, who ruled this part of the country until in the course of the 3rd century, you gradually saw a reawakening of the power of the Greek cities, and the desire to recreate a Greek order against Macedonia. I'll show you the Atheist League at its apogee, at its peak. But the history of the Athenian League lasts for some time. It began in the 3rd century, around the year of the uncharted world, when the first city-states began to unite. Which cities began to unite? That'll interest you. I'm very interested. It's a lot of fun. Essentially, these were the cities that had always been a little secondary. Here's a map of the major Greek cities. Well, you can see a lot of them, Corinth, Negar, Argos, but the big cities, the ones that had weighed in the game for a long time, were Sparta, Athens, and then Thebes. The other cities were a little secondary and always more or less caught in the orbit of another, as I told you, particularly in either some were allied to Athens and others to Sparta, and it was shifting. I can't really put a map on it because it moved regularly. So what characterizes the first cities to unite is that they were cities that had in fact been constantly in this space that had been contested between the great Greek cities for a long time. And if you look closely, in fact, in the Greek cities, if you want to push the parallel and try to see which is the most exact parallel, you have to do the following. Athens corresponds to England. Why is this? Because it was the first city to complete its revolutionary movement. And as it completed its revolutionary movement, as I explained last time and repeated earlier, it was the first to have elites who were merchants, who had a geostrategic interest in maritime imperialism. Hence the creation of the League of Delos. That's why Athens remained the great Greek thalassocracy, deriving its power and income from the sea. Sparta. So in my book Histoire du siècle à venir, at the time, it was at a time when I hadn't understood the history of the construction of the nation state, of its universality, and so I hadn't understood that what I said at the time about Prussia was applicable to France too. So what I thought, because it was a little more naive, a little less refined too, a little young, was that what corresponded to Sparta in the modern period was Prussia and the German Empire it had created. Why was this? Because for me, the equivalent of the Peloponnesian War, as you said earlier, was the First and Second World Wars, since it was the crisis that had lowered Europe to the benefit of the other great powers. In reality, it seems to me that this is not the right criterion. The right criterion is to see that it's the country that's next on the list of those making their revolutionary move. In the case of Sparta, this took place during the Peloponnesian War, since there's a vengeful imperialist in Lysandra who ends up defeating Athens. Well, I'm not going to go into detail about that because that's not the point. So the equivalent of France was Sparta. The country that had truly dominant power on the continent for the longest time. The one with the greatest military record. You know that today, France, look up French military history on Wikipedia and you'll see that there are calculations. France is the country with the biggest military record in the world in terms of participation in battles, victories and so on. And so in this scheme, Thebes is more like her Prussia because Thebes is the one who came to beat and help Athens to definitively defeat Sparta, in the same way that Prussia was present at Leipzig and above all at Waterloo against Napoleon. So if you really want to draw an almost exact parallel between these cities, that's it. And then you have Macedonia, which is Russia, the equivalent of Russia, since Macedonia, the country that first crushed Thebes. Thebes was razed to the ground by Alexander the Great, just as Prussia was completely dissolved by the USSR, i.e. Russia. So to come back to my earlier idea, between these powers, which are the traditional and most important in Greek history, and the same will be true in Europe, you have all this space which has been constantly tossed back and forth between the two, never really able to develop independently, developing a power that has always been victimized, so to speak, by the big nations, forced into a relationship of vassalage, who in fact benefit from the mutual weakening of the great ones. In other words, both the great ones, Athens, Sparta, etc., and the lesser ones, Sparta, etc., benefited from the mutual weakening of the great ones because they've exhausted each other, are then preyed upon by the very big, let's say, Macedonia, Rome, Russia, the United States, as much as the smaller cities locally on their own scale benefit from the fact that the neighboring powers have been brought down, and so they seize this opportunity to unite, to form a coalition that would be the nucleus, in every sense of the word, of the coalition that would unite part, or at least a large part, of Civilization A. In this case, it was the cities of the Achaea being everything west of Corinth, in fact, i.e. the whole northern Peloponnese, like that. A whole bunch of small cities whose names won't mean anything to you because they're not generally known, because they were really small compared to the others, but which united and together became a power, and therefore began to win more and more allies to their cause. Until, let me tell you, at its peak the Achaean League looked like this. And that's it. Megalopolis was a city founded by Epaminondas, a Theban general who had defeated Sparta in an eclipse, and who had liberated Messenia, and who had created Megalopolis, in fact, to block Sparta, to establish a city, and to prevent Sparta from moving up into the Peloponnese and trying to impose itself once again. And what's interesting then is that you have a whole bunch of league leaders who came from Megalopolis, so it was a very important center of the Achaean League. And what's interesting, in fact, is that we can draw a parallel between this city of Megalopolis and, in a way, Belgium, which was created by the Allies against Napoleonic France, to prevent France from overflowing again towards the left bank of the Rhine and Germany. So I'm putting this back to you so you can get your bearings, okay? It's the revenge of the weak, in fact. That is to say, she creates this coalition, and then little by little they manage to swallow up what were cities that were advancing to impose on her. And if you look at Europe, it's the same thing. It's the same because the heart of Europe is Benelux and West Germany, which have traditionally been victimized by neighboring powers throughout the history of Europe. Germany was broken up into a multitude of principalities at the behest of France, who were fighting against, at the time, the great power. It wasn't the great power, it was Austria. But this always added northern Italy to the mix. And the same applies to Benelux. Benelux then is interesting. As an international organization, the Benelux, which brings together Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, was created when Europe was being built. And it starts there as it did in Greece. These are the countries that begin to unite among themselves to become a power equivalent to their larger neighbors, and then promote the model while becoming its center. In fact, since the capital of Europe today is Brussels. So the Benelux is a sort of middle ground ahead of the EU. And so I'm glad I explained the question of the strategic formation of states so well last time, because it gives you a good understanding of this question. You know, I had explained to you that there were spaces between national poles that were often torn apart for a long time, and that it was there that small nations appeared, which didn't make a national revolution and which often hadn't necessarily made an independence revolution, which is the case of the Netherlands. But I don't remember I mentioned that last time. Is all this clear? Dear viewers, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. So it's interesting because you've got an atheist league based on the same model as the EU, involving the same players in the same roles. Then there are other interesting things like England Well, it entered the EU and then it left, as you know, with the Brexit. What's very interesting is that I told you that England corresponds to Athens. That's what corresponds most to Athens. And Athens never wanted to enter. In fact, I'm going to give you the map so you can see it again. Athens never wanted to join the Athenian League, never. It refused and has always decided to remain neutral and upper, which shows the same mentality as England. Thebes, for its part, was not a member of the League, but when the League finally came into conflict with the Romans, because that was the outcome, Thebes was the League's ally.